Hey friends, thank you so much for tuning in. In today's episode, I'll be speaking with Macken Murphy. I asked him to be a guest on the podcast because Macken's unique combination of skills, knowledge, and experience in both realms of media and science. He's the host of one of the world's leading science podcasts, written a popular children's book, and is a renowned scientific researcher and writer focusing largely on animal behavior and evolution. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with Macken, but for those who aren't, here's a candid conversation about his work, social media impact, and his role as a scientific researcher. So let's get into it. Much of your professional life has been centered around animals, including your awesome podcast, Species. So what draws you to animals?
I think I've always been drawn to animals. I mean, I had tons of pets growing up, a veritable menagerie, let's say, of different creatures. And I also, loved consuming animal related content as a kid. And I think, like most people, I more or less grew out of that interest completely in adolescence. And then when I got to college, I can't remember who this quote is from, but the idea that animals are a good tool to think with, so to say. And so I kind of had, from a humanities point of view, let's say, not really a scientific point of view, I developed a real interest in animals as something to think about, right? And someone to think about as well. And then later transitioned, I'd say, to the scientific study of human behavior, humans as animals. And it was probably at that point when I got really interested in both of those things. So thinking about animals from a philosophical point of view, right, and a social point of view, as the aliens that are on the planet with us, let's say, and our closest relatives, right? And I guess I kind of felt at that time that something really weird was happening and everyone was just ignoring it, right? Like, it's very weird that I'm sitting right here and I can see out my window, pigeons flying about, and there were, moorhens here earlier, uh, herons, and so there's these incredible other creatures who are also thinking, feeling, and experiencing and navigating through the world, and we're just kind of ignoring it, not really noticing it. And people are, getting excited about the possibility that aliens might exist, and it's like, we're living on a planet with, other life forms. There is other intelligent life in the universe. It's right outside. And then the flip side of that was that I found it very peculiar, and this was more and more true, and is probably more true than ever now. I found it very peculiar, the resistance to the idea that humans are animals. So I think that people who are very religious, in my experience, tend to deny this outright, and that's what gets a lot of attention. But people who are secular tend to deny this in a different way, right? So secular people will, say that they believe in evolution and they believe humans evolved. But if you start talking about, human instincts, right, and human evolved, our evolved behaviors as an ape, then they start to get extremely uncomfortable and want to change the subject. So I just noticed, I guess, my interest in animal. You asked me what drew me to animals, and I'll preface it by saying that I was always interested in them to some degree, except maybe when I was a teenager and distracted by other things. But then the intellectual interest was really twofold. On the one hand, we're surrounded by intelligent life that we're basically ignoring for the most part, most people. And then on the other side, we are a type of creature, quite patently, right? It's quite patently obvious, and we seem totally content to just ignore that or deny it, even if, titularly we say that we don't.
Wow, that is fascinating. Aliens walking around the planet. I've never really thought about it like that, but that's so true. What inspired you to start the Species podcast?
Well, I loved listening to podcasts. I grew up listening to folks like Dan Carlin, who was a huge inspiration because he had a monologue style podcast. And then, later listened to a bit of Sam Harris as well. Uh, and also stuff you should know. So there were kind of a few different podcasts that were somewhat academic, let's say, and they all had kind of stylistic elements that I admired and liked listening to. But I'd say especially Dan Carlin, right? I loved the monologue format. I loved the drama. And I was a teenager, right? I think I was 19 when I first came up with the idea for Species. And I'd been listening to Dan Carlin for years. And I basically wanted to make my own podcast on a topic that I found interesting. And I considered like, oh, should I do a history podcast as well, because I was getting a history degree at that time. But then I thought, no, that base is more than covered by this incredible, frankly incredible artist, right? If you listen to his stuff, maybe I can do something similar to that, but I can do it instead of about history, about the topic that I really find myself drawn to right now, which is animals. And so I made a little plan and started kind of doodling and thinking in my head. And I just thought, I want to do this so badly that I don't even care if nobody listens. I just want to do this. And so started making episodes, and sure enough, nobody listened for the first like year and a half. But then eventually it's gotten, I would say, a modest, a good audience, right? Like it's got a loyal following, and I do it less now, but uh, that was kind of the story there. I was really yearning to do something creative. I had this creative medium, podcasting, that I was very familiar with growing up listening to podcasts. I guess I'm the youngest generation or the oldest generation that could have grown up listening to podcasts. And I also had this topic that I was enjoying playing with in my head. And this, was just this beautiful opportunity to combine those and, kind of scratch the creative itch and the thinking about animals itch at that time. Again, I do it much less now, but at that time in my life, it was really important to me.
I'm new to the podcast industry, so I get it. What are some of the goals with the podcast?
Oh, there were no real goals. It was just I loved doing it. The goal was to do it itself, and I wanted to keep it. I really wanted to keep it pure as a project, and still do. Like for example, I've never run advertisements, right? I obviously get calls to do ads. Various services that help you monetize podcasts have reached out over the years. Paywall type services, that sort of thing, and sent me really decent estimates of like you could be making X amount of dollars. And I just didn't want to spoil it because to me it was just my little creative playground, and I didn't want to, I don't know, sell mattresses on it. I don't know how else to I don't know how else to put it. So yeah, the goal. There was never a monetary goal. I guess there was probably at some level a goal to get some kind of attention, right? I mean, it might not have been conscious, but I suppose it's telling that I would make this podcast and then not and then post it, right? If it was purely just to do it, I probably wouldn't post it. Like I wanted to share it with people, but I can sincerely say that I remember telling people at that time, I want to do this so badly, and I don't care if nobody listens. And I remember my mother said to me, she was like, "Well, nobody's gonna listen." Da 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 da. I was like, "Well, that's fine." I was like, "If even 100 people ever listen to it, I'd be thrilled." And yeah, I mean, I guess a lot more than that have listened over the years. I used to check the statistics pretty religiously, but I know that we passed 1 million downloads total um, at some point last year. And I know from another company that calculates podcast percentiles that it's in the top 0.5% in terms of downloads. So I mean that's I would consider that much more successful than I had expected. But it's not the sort of thing like to put the million downloads in perspective. I got more I got more views than that. Let's call a download a view, right? It's a little different. A download's a little higher commitment than viewing. Like you can view something on TikTok by accident. You can't really end up listening to a podcast by accident. So it's a little more of a heavy number. But I got more views, and I want to speak carefully here. I think I got more views in the first week, definitely the first month on TikTok, than I had in my entire, 4 years of podcasting before that. So I don't think it's the sort of thing. I don't think that like a podcast about animals is the sort of thing that could ever attract a mass audience. Um, I mean, I say that because I know, like, I looked at like the top, you know, nature podcast rankings, and the ones at the top are like equally unrecognizable. Like, species is like somewhere between 3 and 10, right? And the ones above it are like equally anonymous as podcasts. So, like, species isn't like it's not a big pod. It's big for what it is, right? That's how I think of it. And I didn't ever want it to be big, so I'm not really super invested in that.
What are some common misconceptions about the intelligence and emotional capacities of animals?
Well, the main misconception is that they're not intelligent and they don't have emotional capacities, sadly. I mean, the reason that people should be skeptical of that is that we are animals, and so we know what it's like to be an animal. Now, we know what it's like to be a very specific species of animal, right? But we shouldn't expect, given that we share so much brain architecture, right? If you believe experience and emotion happens in the brain, we share so much brain architecture with other species that it would be kind of weird if they didn't feel anything. Also, they respond to situations in ways that are very familiar, right? Like if you this is something that I do sometimes. It's quite weird, but if you go to a park or any busy living space and just look at humans and kind of relax a little bit and try to take like a really observant, like objective observer point of view and kind of, I won't say dehumanize, but reanimalize the people that you're looking at. It's almost like, I don't know. I mean, I don't go to zoos, as you know, but it's almost like the experience of going to a zoo in the sense that you're just watching animals do very animally things. Like you'll see, couples, pairs, pair bonded apes courting, right? Making sounds to each other and interacting. You'll see, groups of young males, kind of like a group of bachelors, so to say, lounging about, jockeying for status. You'll see, parents with offspring. I don't know. You just, to me, it's just like we're patently, obviously animals and act like them. And I would say, in terms of intelligence, people routinely underestimate the capabilities of animals in very systemic ways. Like, people tend to not know much about animal tool use, animal linguistic capabilities, animal problem solving abilities. And then on the emotional side of things, it's very silly to believe that emotions evolved in our lineage and our lineage alone, given that other animals respond to situations in ways that should be very familiar to us, right? I think that a lot of people who have had pets will probably recognize this, but like your dog, for example, if you have a dog, is not unique in their status of getting excited for things and feeling good. That's dogs are relatively simple mammals, and that's going to be something that's pretty common across the animal kingdom. A pig would be significantly more intelligent and probably more emotionally capable as well. But hard to measure that out. But just from what I've seen in that area.
It's obvious to me that animals are emotional and intelligent, and I've always known that, especially seeing the emotions of my cats growing up. I saw my cats be happy, sad, angry, and so on. How has your professional research played a part in the way you see humans treat animals? How has it changed your behavior?
To be honest, it hasn't because I was vegetarian, but I didn't really know about veganism. I just kind of thought that eggs and milk didn't hurt animals. I just didn't know, truthfully, and I was vegetarian for ethical reasons, before I knew very much about animal cognition, and then I was vegan again, kind of like about a year later, and I still didn't really know that much about the topic. Uh, so it hasn't changed any of my views because the only view that really matters to me from an animal ethics point of view is whether they can suffer, and I just think that's so clear that animals can suffer. It might not be comfortable, right? We might not want that to be true, but I think it's pretty obvious that animals can suffer just like humans, and it's pretty silly and kind of contorted to try and deny that. And I could see that. I always believed that, but I didn't really make the connection and think like, oh, I should probably treat animals differently because to me, food was just food, right? I didn't really make the connection that food was once an animal or was once from an animal. So it was only much later that I picked up on the cognition stuff, and it didn't really change anything to me because I mean, like to think about it clearly, and this is something that you'll sometimes hear philosophers point out. We don't think that more intelligent and more emotionally sophisticated humans are more morally valuable than less emotionally sophisticated and less intelligent humans, right? Like there are definitely tons of people who are more intelligent than me, and there are definitely tons of people who are more emotionally, you know, tuned in than me and feel stronger emotions and more sophisticated emotions. Those people don't have more moral value than me. And similarly, someone who had less of those things than me, I wouldn't see them as having less moral value. And so this idea that like because we as a species have a higher average intelligence than another species that we mean more or matter more, I think that's pretty silly. I also think this argument is going to that argument from intelligence is going to seem very silly due to artificial intelligence. Like I don't think many people would put a high value on the moral, given that we don't seem to think, I mean maybe in the future this will change, but most people don't seem to think that chat gpt is sentient, right? But most people would say that chat gpt is quite intelligent, right? Smarter than most people probably. Doesn't doesn't matter, right? We don't feel bad for it because it's the suffering that really matters. So that was a very long answer to what should have been a simple question, but that is my answer, is just that the research hasn't really had much of an impact on the way I think about animals from a moral perspective.
I also went vegetarian based on the principle that if I love animals, I shouldn't eat them. In your incredible children's book, Animal Sidekicks, you discuss real world collaboration between animals of different species. What are some of your favorite examples of animals working together?
Yeah, I mean, this was a really fun side project that came up quite randomly, and it was actually a Twitter DM. It's kind of funny. I got DM'd by someone who said that they worked for Macmillan, the publisher, and they were basically, "Hey, we want to do a book deal," and they pitched me this idea, and we're like, "Let's work together." And it was really peculiar because it all got done, all the business end of it got done in like 10 days, and it was super casual, and it almost didn't feel real until I was like seeing it in stores and stuff. Animal Sidekicks. And actually, I did a book tour for the kids in England, right? Where I went around to different bookstores and like read to the children. But I just don't look like the sort of guy who reads, right? those videos are very funny. Like I'm in there, like all like larger than them. I'm just like, hello, now I'm going to teach you. But this was one relationship that was very popular among the kids. So it's interesting. So there's this tarantula here, right? And then there's this frog, and they're roommates. It's really peculiar. So basically, the tarantula makes a burrow and lays their eggs in the burrow, right? I hope we can visualize this for people listening. The tarantula will lay eggs in their burrow, and then a frog will go in and sit by the eggs. And the tarantula, even though this tarantula eats frogs, the tarantula won't eat this frog, right? Because that frog eats the ants that sneak past the tarantula and try to get to the eggs. Does that make sense? So there's ants trying to get to the eggs, and they can get past the tarantula because they're much smaller, but they can't get past the frog, who's only slightly bigger and can be, alert to ants. And the frog happily eats the ants and guards the eggs. And what the frog gets, so you might think, like, why is the frog being like a free security guard? The frog is also being guarded by the tarantula, who guards the frog against snakes who want to eat them, right? So it's a roommate situation where I almost said situationship. Oh my gosh. They go to romance. No. Forbidden love. No, they don't. The tarantula guards the frog from snakes, and then the frog guards the tarantula's eggs from bugs. Very, very cool. Now, what the kids really liked though was this situation. So obviously, they've got other things to do than sit in the burrow, and sometimes the tarantula. It's been reported. I mean, it's and this is a Colombian lesser black tarantula, and the dotted humming frog, right? This tarantula, as we said, eats frogs, right? And this frog has other things to do than guard the eggs, so they both will leave the burrow at times. And one thing that's funny is that the tarantula will sometimes, has been witnessed at least, accidentally attacking their own frog, right? They run into each other in the wild and they're like, oh, prey, and they go for it. And then they realize, oh, no, that's my roommate. And they put him back down. Hilarious. So they have the spider can't identify the frogs based on visuals, but they can based on like as soon as it makes contact with like the kind of grabbers up front, they're like, oh my gosh. And so there's this so it's been reported. I mean, it's such a funny anecdote that it kind of is like, is this true? But I do believe it because it's scientists reporting it, and they don't have much incentive to. I mean, this is a lot of stuff that I've dug out of literature. Uh, but yeah, that's what I read back at the time. Maybe the veracity of this has been disputed, but so funny. Apparently, that it's been witnessed that the tarantula is attacking their roommate when they stumble into each other, and then putting them down, apologetically, so to say. So I'd say that's probably. I mean, there's lots of relationships in this book. Uh, One thing that will interest you is that and we talked about, and I put this in the book as well, is that humans technically have it, and it sounds counterintuitive, especially to us as vegans, but humans technically have a symbiotic relationship with our farm animals in the sense that both of us gain reproductive benefits, right? So nature doesn't care about suffering. Nature cares about survival and reproduction. And chickens, cows, pigs, they've become some of the most populous species on planet Earth through their association with us, right? And vice versa, we've expanded our population tremendously by exploiting them. And so, technically, from a pure nature point of view, this would be called a symbiotic. Not just symbiotic, to be honest, because symbiosis can also, the broad sense symbiosis can include parasitism and things like that. But this would be mutualism, right? It's a mutually beneficial relationship from an evolutionary standpoint. And this is a really important thing to note because something can be beneficial from an evolutionary standpoint and extremely detrimental from a personal standpoint. And I'll just pluck out one random example of this from nature. Anglerfish, these animals with the very famous animals, they've got the light on the end of the thing. Those are the females. Ones you recognize are the females. The males are basically tiny little sperm sacs that go around trying to, trying to mate. Essentially, they don't do much else. Whereas the females are these large, robust organisms. And the males, when they, maybe only in some species, but certainly in some, they will essentially destroy themselves in the process of reproduction, right? They will attach themselves to the female and basically dissolve into her, right? And so this is very beneficial from an evolutionary standpoint because they've reproduced, they've gotten their genes into the next generation. But from a personal standpoint, it's essentially suicide. And so this is what the point I'm getting at is that there's a difference between fitness benefits and personal benefits. To bring it into a more human side of things, right, in our own lives, a lot of people choose not to have kids, right? From an evolutionary standpoint, this is a very unpleasant choice, but from a personal standpoint, in some cases, it might make their lives better, right? They might be happier, they might have more free time, it might just suit them more not to become parents. So that's a few things to help people understand symbiosis. And again, that all of those, well, not all of those, but the example I was talking about earlier is mutualism, but there are also symbiotic relationships that prey on the. It's confusing to people because people think symbiosis, they think mutually beneficial, but there's other types of symbiosis such as commensalism, such as parasitism, that are either not beneficial or even actively harmful towards one of the participants, or at least one, I should say.
How can these acts of symbiosis that you lay out in the book inspire humans in our relationships with animals?
Not sure. I think nature is kind of a rough place to take inspiration from because it's so brutal. I feel like morality is, in as much as morality is a thing, it's when we rise above our nature, not when we just blindly lean into it. So, for example, I study human infidelity, right? I'd say that part of the reason that not cheating is a morally good thing is because we have instincts, intuitions, emotional drives towards cheating, right? So resisting that is where it becomes good. Not cheating wouldn't be virtuous if nobody wanted to do it, right? You know what I'm saying? It's like
Yeah.
not being violent wouldn't be virtuous if nobody like no if nobody had violent impulses, right? I'd say most people have some degree of violent impulses occasionally throughout their lives, right? People, lose their temper, have a flash of anger, that sort of thing. That's the opportunity to be moral. And the same way with because a lot of people talk about like, oh, how can because people will know my evolutionary background, and then they're like, how can you be vegan, right? And it's like, mate, I can be vegan the same way that I don't, have affairs, the same way that I don't start physical altercations with other males, right? Uh, it's just it's just something to avoid because I even if it's natural, it's totally natural for an ape like me to, engage in I don't know what you'd call it, sexual indiscretion, so to say, sexual affairs and whatnot. And it's totally natural for an ape like me to want to fight other males, right? And it's totally natural for an ape like me to want to eat meat. But I don't do any of those things because I don't base my morality off of my evolutionary history.
Why are you vegan?
Oh, suffering. It's just reducing suffering. I'm a utilitarian and was kind of raised that way. Not utilitarian in the really. I mean, my parents were both secular people, but I'd say they both took a relatively utilitarian stance towards the world. And yeah, it's kind of funny because people hear I'm kind of shy even saying that word utilitarian because people think that that means things that it doesn't necessarily. Certainly for some utilitarians it would, but I just think that suffering when it doesn't seem to lead to anything productive, right? When it doesn't seem to be for any greater good is wrong. And in my case, given my cultural situation, right, where I am. I'm in England, for what it's worth, and in Australia for most of the year. I just happen to be in England right now. It's so easy for me not to kill animals, right? Like that's just dead easy. And every time I swipe my credit card at a store and buy meat, let's say, not that I do that, but I'm saying that like if I were to do that, then I'd be causing suffering, right? And so for me, I mean, obviously, like I've got loads of friends, family who are non-vegan, and it just kind of is what it is. But for me personally, given my values, I want to minimize that as much as feasible, and for me, that means veganism. Yeah.
Being vegan is the best way that we can reduce suffering. I know that we both really value how useful media can be in amplifying the stories of animals. How do you feel storytelling and education can shift perceptions and behaviors towards animals?
I think that the type of storytelling that I do, or that I did for a very long time, mostly impacts people's views of animals through amazement. Right? It's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that we live with creatures like this. I think that the type of storytelling you do is one that more begets compassion, right? Through showing, through advertising emotional abilities, or advertising, suffering directly, and amplifying that. And I think that that's a pretty powerful route towards towards people caring. Yeah, is being able to connect with the our shared nature with other creatures, and also understand the depth of their suffering.
How do you feel the world would get better for animals?
I don't know. I've become more and more pessimistic about this. I used to think that the world was going to get better and change very fast. And now I'm not certain if or to what degree it'll change at all. I just think that most people don't care about animals more than they care about their own convenience or their own physical pleasure. And that might be inbuilt into us, right? It might be that, for the most part, humans don't feel that type of connection to animals because of evolution, right? Because we evolved to kill animals to some extent. Yeah, I'm pretty pessimistic, to be honest. I think that it's possible that some kind of technological shifts, such as lab grown or cultured or whatever they call it, meat, where it tastes exactly the same and it's chemically indistinguishable, but no animal was harmed in the making. I think that that is probably the best shot. I mean, I did street activism and writing for years, and I think that that definitely gets a certain percentage of people, but I don't think it has that much. I don't know. I mean, I'd have to take another look at the statistics, but I don't know. Like, is veganism growing right now? Is that something that's happening, or is it kind of teetering along at 3 to 5% of people? I'm not sure. And then the other end of it is that as we in the West are becoming more vegan and vegetarian, let's say, a lot of poorer countries are, having a meat revolution, so to say. Like they used to not eat that much meat, and now they're eating more than ever. And so it's possible that things are getting worse overall, even if, in England or in America, they might be getting better. I don't know. I mean, but I also don't really think that much from that perspective anymore because it is too depressing. I just try to focus. Like, I don't really engage in activism that much anymore. I just try to focus on me, and it's like, if at the end of the day I feel that I am not contributing, or at least I'm not contributing very much to the suffering of animals, then I can sleep at night. I think eventually things will change, but I'm just saying that I think it'll probably be technological in the end, and I think that activism will take us, might get us to 10%, right? But when I speak to people, it's remarkable to me how few people actually care about the suffering of animals. I'd say most people don't.
Today, if you stroll through even Walmart, you'll find a dedicated half aisle brimming with plant based milk options. Literally, like 20 or 30 different kinds, many different brands. It's incredible, and it's becoming way more convenient. As a result, we are seeing a decline in the market share of traditional cow's milk. What role do you see research and technology playing in the future of animal rights?
Well, I really like the point that you're making because what you just said, even just listening to you speak there, I became more optimistic because you're right that, maybe looking over 6 years, nothing much has changed. Because when I first got into veganism, I was kind of having a personal revolution, right? And so I thought, oh, it's only a matter of time. I've seen the light, everyone will soon enough, right? Then I became kind of jaded because it's like, look, I would do a lot of street activism and things, and I would see exactly what you see, where it's like, oh, they care about it, but at the end of the day, they don't care about it enough to do anything. And to me, that's functionally the same as not caring, right? Like if I say, I don't know, I don't even need to give an analogy to that, but you're right that maybe 60 years ago I wouldn't have been vegan, right? That's entirely possible. I would like to say that I would have been, right? But veganism barely existed. There were barely options. It would have been really hard. And you know, now what would that be? 6 years ago, 1964, right? Like veganism was invented then at that point, but I doubt there was any real options. It certainly wouldn't have been on menus, that sort of thing. Exactly. So it's like, would I have? And I certainly wouldn't have had other people to tell me about it. So you're right that I think that, over the last 20 years, there has been, a tremendous sea change in what's available. And now you asked about the future. I think that social media, making it people be able to witness what's going on in these, torture chambers. I think that that's been huge. Obviously, you've had huge success as a social media activist, right? I think a lot of people go vegan off of that. And so that's one technological area where as we become more and more online, we also become, there's downsides to it, but one upside is we become more aware of bad things in the world and our part in them. And there's downsides to that as well. But also, which we already discussed, more options, right? More food varieties that are good. That's great. And other than that, though, it's kind of hard to see how else research and technology can help because we already know so much about animal cognition. I mean, that's a revolution in terms of our understanding. Research on animal cognition, that's like that's old news as in like 30 to 40 years old news, right? That's like really old news that animals think and have feelings. There's nobody that I speak to. There's literally nobody that I speak to in academia who doesn't think that animals can suffer, right? Anyone who knows anything about cognition thinks that, right? So I think that research was probably important, showing that animals are intelligent and can suffer, but I don't think it has much more. I think that the marginal value has already been eclipsed, and more research in that area probably isn't going to make any more vegans. But technology making it easier to go vegan is, and technology making it easier to communicate about veganism, such as what you're taking advantage of here today, and with social media in general, probably is as well.
Agreed. Like you said, the research has basically been done, and we don't really need any more research. I believe the future of animal rights depends heavily on technology. Unfortunately, there are some big roadblocks in that regard. The agricultural lobbies wield immense power, making it incredibly challenging to prompt change within their ranks.
Is that just the agricultural lobbies? Who's trying to ban it? Really?
To put it into perspective, the marketing budget of McDonald's advertising alone surpasses that of the entire farm animal protection movement combined. Can you believe that? And so we must continue pushing consistently and persistently. With that being said, I do maintain a general optimism about the future, even if it may take many years or decades to fully realize. I'm very happy that you are doing great work to help in that regard, Macken. Thank you so much for your time and for your contributions. And if there's any way that people can take action and follow your work, I'd love to hear it.
Take action with me. I wish that there was something I could point you to, but really, I'd say at this point in my career, I'm just a vegan who is doing unrelated stuff mostly. I used to, write for some, vegan publications and whatnot, and engage in a lot of activism. But I mean, if they're interested in just my work in general, you can go to my website, mackenmurphy.org, or just Google me, and a lot of stuff will come up that can be consumed. There's, hundreds of hours of me speaking online. If this hour wasn't enough, I'm I'm sure it was. I'm sure that today was plenty for most of you. But yeah, I mean, I love animals to bits, and I want to see the best for them. And I'll always be vegan, and I'll like that. Like that's certain. And I'm never going to be shy about speaking up for them. And if there's ever an opportunity for me to, throw money in the right direction, that's something that I'll take.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Macken.
Thank you, John. It was really great to be one of your first guests after you did me so many favors when my podcast was tiny. So I appreciate it.
That was such an informing conversation. Macken's work is well-rounded and compelling. I am very aligned in Macken's awe of animals and his desire to create a better world for them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you felt like the conversation was meaningful, please share it with your family and friends. Also, please like, share, and subscribe to listen to upcoming episodes.